Welcome back to the second semester of the 10 Commandments, and we'll be looking at lecture number 1, part 1. And we're going to be specifically studying this semester the commandments number 6 through 10. So let's go right into the text in Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to be looking at this. And let's start from the beginning so we can put it in its context completely. Exodus chapter 20, and we'll be looking at the first 17 verses there. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for lo, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female servants or your cattle or your sojourner or who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which your Lord your God gives you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servants, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, as we look at these 10 commandments in its proper context, I want to draw your attention and focus in on the 6th commandment as we begin to look at this. And this 6th commandment is dealing with the issue of the sanctity of human life. The sanctity of human life. And I want to draw your attention to 4 words that are found in verse 13. And this is the 6th commandment. And it says, you shall not murder. You shall not murder. Now, I want to draw your attention to another distinction here as we begin to unfold this discussion. In the majority of the translations that you find out there, it does not say you shall not murder. It says you shall not kill. You should not kill. However, when you go to the original manuscripts and you become to discover in the original languages in Hebrew, for reasons that I personally do not understand, however, the Hebrew word there is not the word rasach, which means kill. It's the word tisar, which means murder. So in other words, in the Hebrew text, it reads this way, lo tisar. Okay, which means you shall not murder. In the concordance, you'll find and you'll discover that it says lo rasach. You shall not kill. Now, there is a tremendous distinction that must be made here, because if you leave it, you shall not kill, that's a blanket statement that covers absolutely anything and everything which makes God himself guilty of this violation, under all the violation of this commandment, which does not make sense. So I want to draw your attention that it should read lo tazar as I study the Hebrew text, and I want to draw that because it has tremendous implications for our understanding of the 6th commandment. Now, I want us to begin consideration of this commandment by pointing out that contrary to many translations, it does not say, once again, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not, or lo rasa. That's not what it says. But instead it says, thou shalt not murder, or lo tisar in the Hebrew. So I want you to understand that the Hebrew stem, rasar, used only to refer to the unlawful taking of human life. The word is never used in connection with 3 different things, and I want to draw your attention to that. Excuse me. 3 things. Okay? There is a distinction between capital punishment. There is a distinction between killing at war, and there is a distinction of divine action. So I want you to understand those 3 categories: capital punishment, killing in war, and as well as divine action. And so I want you to understand that when we use this verse Exodus 20:13, when it says, you shall not murder, or lo tazar, okay? It is never used in connection with capital punishment, never used in connection with killing in war, and never used in connection with the divine action on the part of God. So you cannot render this text to say, thou shalt not kill, although that is a popular rendering of it. Right? The text draws an important distinction between what we would call felonious murder, that is the killing of a human being without justification or excuse. So what we want to do is unfold in this class, and perhaps in the next 2-3 classes, is the Hebrew perspective, the Jewish perspective, the background, the foundational background to this particular concept of lo tazar, or you shall not murder, so that we have a clearer understanding, okay, of how this verse gets translated into the New Testament to all of us. This is in fact a commandment that was given to the nation of Israel, but it was given to the nation through Israel to the world, to us today. And I want to remind you also that the 10 Commandments are reaffirmed over and repeatedly in the New Testament. So for those of us who want to pursue the argument that the 10 Commandments is an antiquated law, a law that was only applicable to the Jewish nation, you have a problem then, because not only do you discard the Old Testament, you must be willing to discard the New Testament as well. So coming from a Hebrew perspective, let's look at this as foundational background information for us. Again, I draw your attention that the text draws an important distinction between felonious murder, which basically means the killing of a human being without justification or excuse, and all other categories of homicide. In this regard, it is noteworthy that the sages of old, or the rabbis of old, okay, the Jewish wise men of old, those who were during the period of the writing of the Talmud, during the period of the writing of the Midrash, because these are the people who took time to explain the Word of God to us in its proper social, cultural, historical context. Now, I want to draw also your attention to this, and that is that they recognize the sages of old, or the Jewish wise men, or the rabbis, his scholars. Here's how they recognize this. They recognize 3 forms of non-felonious homicide. I want you to note that. There are 3 forms of non-felonious homicide, and that is number 1, justifiable homicide, number 2, excusable homicide, and number 3, culpable homicide. So we have 3 categories, and that would be justifiable, excusable, and culpable. Now, I have people that I know who are attorneys, okay, and when we get into these discussions, there are fine lines, and they're very crucial, in particular when you're defending a client in court. And so I want to draw your attention. We're familiar with these concepts in the modern era. We just never looked at it in terms of this 6th commandment, you shall not murder. In brief, justifiable homicide would include the execution of a lawfully condemned criminal, the killing of a criminal to save the life of a third party, or the killing of a person attempting rape, adultery, incest, or pederasty, and killing another person in self-defense. That's what we would call justifiable homicide. Then we have what's called a second category, excusable homicide. May either be fortuitous or accidental. The former referring to a situation in which one is climbing a ladder that breaks and the climber falls and kills a bystander. Okay? So that would be an accidental homicide, a fortuitous homicide. Okay? This would be excusable homicide. Right? The person's climbing up the ladder. They have to pay attention on their way up, and for some reason the ladder breaks and the person falls down. There's somebody walking underneath, and they fall on that person and kill that person. That would be excusable homicide. Now, the ladder, there's another person here, is descending the ladder and breaks and kills a person. Now, this person is coming down the ladder. The distinction is important, and I want to draw your attention to that. Excuse me. Now, the fortuitous homicide does not incur a penalty, okay? Whereas an accidental homicide incurs the penalty. I know that sounds kind of strange, to us, but that is because we don't understand how the terms are used. Okay? Now, in the accidental homicide, it incurs the penalty of what in the Old Testament? Banishment. They were banned from the city, from their clan, from their tribe. They were banned from their village where they lived at, wherever they were. Okay? And it is presumed that the accidental killing should have been prevented because the person coming down the ladder was in a better position to see what was passing below him and to take the appropriate precautions than someone ascending the ladder. So that's the reason why an accidental homicide, in other words, is preventable. Yes, it was an accident, but it was clearly preventable. A fortuitous homicide, it would be the opposite. The person is going up the ladder, cannot see what's coming down behind him or underneath him, versus the person who's going down the ladder, descending down the ladder, and can clearly see and prevent it, could have stopped in time to make sure the person passes before they continue descending. So I need you to understand, when we get into what's called excusable homicide, there are distinctions, and if you don't believe me, just go to court and you'll discover that. Then we go for a third category. The third category, okay, homicide is what's considered culpable homicide. Culpable homicide, okay? And I want you to note that difference. And when it is the result of gross negligence, as in the case when one kills a perpetrator in order to prevent a crime, when less lethal means of doing so are available. When the homicide is committed through ignorance of the law, or when the criminal is not the immediate cause of an unlawful death, but an accessory before the fact. So I want to draw your attention to that. Now, I live in Los Angeles in California, and we have our crime rate just as anybody else around the country. And I've had the experience when my house was burglarized when we were not home. And upon coming home to discover that, and the police officers will come by, and on a number of different occasions that I've had conversations with police officers, I'm always amazed how they all tell me that what you do with a burglar or a thief that's coming into your home is that you shoot him, and you shoot him dead and drag him over the threshold, and you leave him there, and then we come and we will call that justifiable. Okay? And that is to get rid of the thief or the burglar. I'm not so sure about that counsel, but that is a counsel that they have given to us on several occasions. Right? And I want you to note that in fact, all right, according to the scripture, or at least according to how the rabbis of old, the Jewish wise men, the sages of old, when they explain the distinctions of what the intent of this sixth commandment is, it just does not line up with that concept. Now, culpable homicide in these cases is not considered capital crime from the standpoint of a judicial system of law. But the perpetrator may be slain by what we call in the Old Testament the avenger of blood, in accordance with biblical law. Now, if you recall your Old Testament, the avenger of blood is an ancient institution designed to maintain what was called an interclan or intertribal balance of power by killing the person who upset the balance by killing a member of another clan or tribe, an institution that the Torah itself, the first 5 books of the Bible, okay, ultimately sought to eliminate, but could not do so before a well-ordered society was in fact established. In addition to those mentioned, there are other types of culpable homicide over which a court may exercise a range of punitive options depending on the circumstances of the homicide and the needs of the society. And so I want to draw your attention to that as well. So you note that it says, you shall not murder. And then we need to understand, what does that actually mean, lo tazar, in the Hebrew text? Because this, by and large, is a Hebrew book, clearly the Old Testament, and as well as a Gentile book today, because it was through the nation of Israel, through the nation of the Jews, that salvation comes to us. Remember that we are the ones who are adopted into the family. God created that nation. He created his chosen people, but we are adopted into that family. And do not forget that the law is given to Israel, but through Israel to us today. And as we continue this concept of homicide, okay, it is noteworthy that this prohibition against felonious homicide, which is dictated by common sense, in that no society in which murder was condoned could long be viable, is nonetheless proclaimed as a divine imperative. And I want to draw that attention to you, that I want to draw your attention to that it's a divine imperative, a divine command, right, making its commission not only a criminal act condemned in all society, but also crime against God. So when you take a life, all right, you are committing a crime against God. For that person was made in the image of God. It's an extension of the person of God. So you commit a crime against God. For the sages, or the Jewish wise men, the old rabbis of old, okay, murder is intrinsically inimical. In other words, it's always injurious or harmful to reason. In other words, it never makes any sense whatsoever. Why? Because it was asked, would one douse a light that he was incapable of rekindling? Think about it. Would you turn the only source of light off that you had, that you did not have the ability to turn back on? That's contrary to reason, or cause the loss of a soul that he was incapable of restoring without the due process of law. So the only person who has the ability to restore life is God, and God himself. You nor I have that ability. Thus, it is contrary to reason that we would take a human life unless it falls under divine action, a divine command, a divine imperative. And we'll discuss that a little bit further later. So it behooves man to recognize that whereas he has the power to bring about death, his power to restore to life is extremely limited and clearly uncertain. God alone has complete power in this regard. Man does not. In spite of all the scientific and medical breakthroughs that we have today, man still cannot restore life. Man may murder and hide his guilt from man, but he cannot hide from God that he has destroyed that which God has created. So we need to comprehend that murder, you shall not murder, is in fact destroying what God has created. It is only God and God alone who has the right to give life and the right to take life. You do recall Job. When Job spoke, he says, I've come into this world with nothing, and nothing I am going to leave this world. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so we need to comprehend that society, even society itself, its hands of the judicial system are tied to certain biblical principles. It is also noteworthy that some considered the commandment to apply not only to felonious homicide, but also to suicide. And I need you to comprehend that. And I realize that you and I live in an era, you and I live in a time and an age where we now have euthanasia, that is the taking of the life of our elderly. All you need to do is to go to the hospital today, and as a pastor, I can see this very clearly, where the family is tired of an elderly member who's no longer living a life, a quality of life as defined by human beings. And so what we now have is legalized, quote unquote, murder, although that's not what they call it. They call it euthanasia. They kind of try to whitewash with the process, and this is how it works. They increase the level of morphine or other medications into the system intravenously into the person, so that the body goes into shock and the person just quietly goes away and dies. And now they don't even call it that. They call it now the process of expiration. The person has expired. They try to make this in such a way as to always eliminate any language or any reference to the possibility that murder has taken place. Then we also have in our society today is the killing of the unborn child, but it's still a child who's been formed in the womb of a mother. And we've heard all of the horrific stories that take place in our nation, in our country, where now we're into millions upon millions upon millions of babies who are being murdered, and that is the term, murdered, okay? But we use other fancy little terms such as abortion, or the child has expired, okay, in the gestation period. So we begin to try to whitewash this process using terms, okay, that never refer to the possibility that conscientiously we have broken a moral law. So we also live in a country where we will fight for the rights of animals and save the whales, and the very same people who are fighting for that, by and large, a large portion, I'm not saying all, but a very large portion of them who want to save the trees and the plants, and they want to save the animals in the sky, and they want to make them sure that the earth is green and all that. That's wonderful. I have nothing against that. Are the same very people who will tell you that we have the right to put our elderly down, allow them to die, okay, by over-medicating them, and that's murder, and killing the unborn child, okay, and we call it abortion, that is murder. And so we have these states of contradictions in our country, and so you would be aghast, okay, you would be shocked, by and large, because on our daily television stations and news media and our programs and so forth, and the radio and newspapers, we're constantly hearing of other people taking other people's lives in an act of murder and what we would call senseless killings and so forth. And we're shocked by that. How can we be shocked by that when many of us also happen to believe in abortion and euthanasia? Or we withhold the hand of God, that God has given us the ability to help others who are dying and starving to death around the world, and we sit here smugged and doing absolutely nothing, and yet it's well within your capacity to prevent that. What is that called? So I want you to understand that it is noteworthy that some considered the commandment to apply not only to felonious homicide, but also to suicide. Thou shalt not murder means also thou shalt not murder thyself. Thou shalt not cause thy own blood to cry out bloody murder against thee. So I want you to comprehend that also under the teaching and the explanation of the sages of old, the wise men of old, under the rabbis of old, and clearly as they break out and explain in detail what this commandment means, thou shalt not murder, clearly in the Talmud, in the Midrash, okay, also includes these acts of violence. Let's return back to our class, Lecture 1, Part 2, and let's go back to the discussion that we were having in our last class, and let's return to the 6th commandment, Lo tazar, you shall not murder, Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, you shall not murder. Let's go back and begin to understand in the context of the conversation that we were having last week, and I want to draw your attention to the book of Genesis as well in this class. Now, to fully grasp the implications of this commandment, you shall not murder, a consideration of the biblical abhorrence of bloodshed may in fact be helpful to us today. And for this, we must return to the story of the deluge, or what we know as the flood, and its aftermath as it is related in the book of Genesis. Now, having survived the great flood in an ark, and I want to draw your attention to Genesis chapter 9, please. Genesis chapter 9, turn your Bibles there. because having survived the great flood in the ark, Noah and his family were faced by the problem of surviving in an environment in which virtually everything was in fact destroyed. To persevere, mankind would have to modify its relationship with the creatures of the earth that had similarly survived. You do recall that it was Noah, okay, along with the animals in the ark that had in fact survived. Okay? The antediluvian, or before the flood, harmony that had existed between man and the animal world would have to now be altered forever. Man, who had been before herbivorous, okay, and herbivorous, would now have to become carnivore in order to survive. You do recall that prior to the flood, during the antediluvian period, there was this harmonic relationship between man and animals, and then after the flood, that relationship had to in fact be altered if man was going to survive. This is a divine action. This was caused by God and God alone. He has to now alter this harmonic relationship so that man can survive. Now, why did he have to alter that? Because man had violated once again the commands of God, to the extent that God had to destroy the world through the flood. Unlike Adam, who was nurtured in the Garden of Eden, which abounded with fruits, Noah and his sons found themselves in a place where virtually all edible vegetables had been wiped out, or at least temporarily during the flood and immediately after the flood. There was a little doubt about their need for food would rapidly outstrip the limited supply available from the earth, for which they would be in competing with so many other creatures. Only by becoming meat eaters, only by consuming their competitors, could they in fact survive. So I need you to comprehend what is taking place here, and keep in mind the sixth commandment: you shall not murder. It does not say you shall not kill. Although that is the popular rendering in many translations, there is a complete distinction. There's a vast difference between killing and murder. A vast difference, and that's what we're focusing in on in this discussion. Now, again, I draw your attention to Genesis chapter 9, and we should be there by now. And I want to draw your attention specifically to verse 3. Now, in the Hebrew text, as I read the Hebrew text here, I want you to note this with me, because this is what takes place. It says in verse 9, and remember, I'm reading out of the New American Standard Version. You may have King James, New King James, English Standard Version, the New International Version, whatever version you happen to be. The text that I'm working from is the New American Standard Version, and I compare that with the original text in the Hebrew to see where we are with regard to a proper translation. Now, the translation says this in Genesis chapter 9, verse 3. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. He says, I give all to you as I gave the green plant. Now notice, there is a tremendous change in the command that God has now given, a change radically different from what was given in Genesis chapter 1. By so instructing the Noahites, or in other words, Noah's family and descendants, God precluded the other option open to them, which was to kill as many of the creatures of the earth and sky as possible in order to reduce the competition for whatever food might have been garnered from the earth. Now, this represented what we would call a radical change from the original divine charge to man, which was to conquer the natural world and to subdue it and not to destroy it. So to subdue the world and to destroy the world are vast difference. Just like night and day, I want you to understand that. So the relationship between man and animal before the flood and after the flood is radically changed, because the center of concern on the earth is man, not the vegetation, not animals. Now, that does not give you the right to just indiscriminately destroy the earth and indiscriminately just shoot and kill animals. That's not what we're promoting here, so do not misunderstand what I'm saying. However, what I do want to draw your attention to is that the center of concern is man. Man must now survive after the flood. This represented a radical change from the original divine charge to man. Now draw your attention to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And then hold your place in Genesis chapter 9, because we're going to be going back there. And this is not a study of the book of Genesis, although I highly recommend going through the book of Genesis, because it is the seed plot of the Bible. It is the beginning of the Bible, and it also establishes many of these principles that we see later on discussed throughout the Old Testament and well into the New Testament. Now, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, note what is said here. God blessed them, and God said to them. Now, he's speaking to man. You remember, we have Adam and Eve. He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Notice what it says, subdue it. It does not say destroy it. And rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on earth. So man is given headship, okay, over the entire earth and everything therein thereof. Now, by force of circumstances, man is given permission now to destroy as much of it as necessary, not as possible, but as necessary to provide sufficient food to assure his physical survival. But he was not to become a scavenger, feeding on the carrion, or in other words, on dead or decaying fish, such as buzzards and vultures do. You are prohibited from doing that. So I want to draw your attention to that as well. You are not to just be indiscriminately eating dead food that has now just been rotting away, such as vultures and buzzards do all the time. Now, man, he was placed under the constraint, and note this back in Genesis chapter 9, verse 2. It says this, the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. Now, if you remember, during the antediluvian period or before the flood, man and animals were in a state of harmony. There was a harmonic relationship. Animals did not fear man, and man did not fear animals. After the flood, God sovereignly places into the soul, if you will, into the essence and the being, if you will, of the animals, or as people will call it, into the spirit of the animal, okay? Fear. That the animal is to fear man now. And he says, look at this, what he says here in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 9. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the sky. So all the birds, all the beasts, everything that creeps in the ground, and all the fish of the sea are now to fear man. Why? Because sovereignly, God is a sovereign God. He now moves upon his creation in the animal world to fear man, because now not only does man subdue everything that's on the earth, but now man is the central concern for God, and man must survive. And as a result, he now must become, he moves from a state of being herbivorous, to now being carnivorous. So now he moves from the vegetation, plant life, eating greens, if you will, to now eating meat as well, if he's going to survive. And the animal world now comprehends that they become prey to man. And this is a sovereign act of God. This is what we call divine action. And so he says, into your hand they are given. So all those who want to save this and save that and save this and save that, you have not comprehended, right? And I'm not talking about wiping out species. That's not what I'm talking about. But the pendulum has swung the other way to the extreme that we ignore divine commandments. In this way, the problem of enduring food supply would be resolved, and killing animals for food had become a practical necessity. However, because man was intended to be above the rest of created nature and was charged to care for it, even when out of necessity he is compelled to destroy certain elements of it, he is to be wary of that his shedding of animal blood does not become an end in itself, a thirst after bloodshed. Though he may kill for food like the animal, he must still not be animal-like in his demeanor. In other words, what you need to comprehend is that if we comprehend Genesis chapter 9 clearly in this divine commandment that's being given in the altering of the state of the harmonic relationship between man and animal life, okay? In here, you're not given permission to be a hunter or a sporting for animals, killing animals indiscriminately just because it happens to be your sport. That, unfortunately, okay, is not written into this divine commandment. Now, there is the thinning out of herds, okay, in order for the herds to properly survive. That is quite different rather than just simply shooting and maiming and killing for the sake of shooting, maiming, and killing. Those are breaking divine commands on the part of God because man has not been given that permission to do that. He is to subdue and to eat for practical necessity, but he is not to be sport-like in killing indiscriminately animals just for the sake of killing animals. He must not, like the wild beast, tear his prey apart, eat its flesh while its heart is still pumping and blood through its vessels. So in other words, we are commanded not to eat meat with blood that it continues to flow. Why? Because life is in the blood. Now note what it says in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 4. Only you shall not eat, notice this, you shall not do what? You shall not do what? You shall not eat with its life, that is its blood. And I want to draw your attention to that. It's really important because I know that it's very popular among people to eat a meat today and let the blood flow. Okay? Well, according to scriptures, and the scriptures is not changed, okay, you are prohibited from doing that. And so much for my commentary on your cuisine. Now, man who is capable of killing for the sake of killing must learn to abhor blood, particularly the taste of fresh blood. He must differentiate himself from the animal as much as possible. Nonetheless, might not brutality to animals breed brutality to humans as well? And that, of course, is exactly what does take place. Once having permitted the killing of animals, it became necessary to place clear and appropriate restraints on man's behavior. He might kill only for food I want you to mark that, okay, underscore that, only for food. However, man is not food for man. Man is not to be considered in the same category as the creatures of the world, and he must learn to make a basic distinction between his fellow humans and the rest of the animate world. Accordingly, he is warned. Now look at Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. Surely, he says in verse 5, I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it, and from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. So you cannot kill man for food. You are not to you cannot eat man for food. Man was not designed, okay, to be food for man. That's not what you were designed for. I need you to comprehend that. Now, all of you may or may not remember many years ago, there was a plane crash in the Andes in South America, in the high mountains there, and how the people survived is by eating each other. Now, I'm not sure, okay, what you would have done or what we would have done in that circumstances. But I do understand that today, comprehending the scriptures, I know what I could not have done. Do you hear what I'm saying? I know what I could not have done. Those people literally ate the people who died in order to survive. and they justify it. In fact, I've seen some interviews that were given later on, okay, and how they never were able to get over that fact, okay? And they said there was something profoundly wrong with what they did in order to survive. And they couldn't figure it out. They were confused, and it was very simple, okay? God had placed a divine restriction in the spirit of man. And we can see that here in Genesis in chapter 9 and verse 5. He says, surely I will require your life, but from every beast I will require it. And from every man, for every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whosoever might dare to shed the blood of another human will have to answer for it to God. Indeed, even the person who would take his own life, if you recall that we mentioned that in the last class, okay, you will have to answer for it. So sacred is human life that even the perpetrator of an unintentional killing of a human, let alone an intentional killing, will be called to account at the hand of man, understood to refer to the judicial system, even at the hand of every man's brother, understood to refer to the ancient tradition of the avenger of blood, will I require the life of man. That's the reason why the death penalty is in place, and why the death penalty is a divine action, a divine order by the part of a divine sovereign God. And yet, in our country, as in many other countries around the world, we have now banned the death penalty. We're now literally faced up against God and telling him, no, we refuse to submit to your rule of law. Even the beast that kills a human will be called to account. Not that the animal has volition and is capable of a deliberate act, but because man is the central concern of the universe and all of nature is for his benefit. So that's the reason why animals who attack human beings, okay, have tasted the blood, tend to come back to attack human beings again. And that's the reason why the animal is killed, because now this animal has instinctively tasted the blood of man and will always seek it out. And that's the reason why animals are put down. And now, here again, we now have those who want to save the animals. And what they do is they tell people, do not kill them, just release them in the wild. And what they tend to do is come back into those communities and attack again. Therefore, anything within nature that acts against man is to be considered dysfunctional, serving no valid purpose, and its existence is therefore to be considered forfeit. Moreover, with regard to those with temerity, in other words, confident and unafraid of danger or punishment, those with wanton reckless disregard, I'm not afraid, I don't care, and I don't give this and I don't give that, okay? To consciously violate the divine injunction and deliberately take a human life, society must not, listen to this carefully, must not await divine punishment. You cannot await divine punishment of the perpetrator, but must itself take retributive action. In other words, that's the reason why we have a police force, that's the reason why we have courts, that's the reason why we have prison systems, and that's the reason why we have execution. You are commanded not to wait for the person to have to respond to God in the end. Society is commanded. Look at this with me in Genesis chapter 9. And I know that we have a lot of people in the church today who are against the death penalty, and they're marching up and down with their placards and so forth and so forth and so forth, okay? And that is because they have either done one or two things, and perhaps more, and that is to ignore completely what Scripture says here in Genesis chapter 9. And look at what he says in verse 6. 9 verse 6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So he says man now must judicially, legally take the life of another man who has shed the blood of another man. Man must rationally order his universe and protect its viability and capacity for perseverance. Society must root out that which would endanger it from within. As the God's viceroy on earth, as his representative, man is charged with the responsibility for meting out justice in the human society. That's our responsibility. Human life is sacrosanct, and for in the image of Elohim, God made he man. Thus, the sages of old, the rabbis of old, this is what they taught. And just listen to what they said. If one sheds blood, it is accounted to him as though he had diminished the divine image. I'm going to repeat it. If one sheds blood, it is accounted to him as though he had diminished the divine image. As a transgression against man is thus also a transgression against God. The prohibition against felonious homicide is given in the Decalogue, or what we would call the Ten Commandments, and the penalty is made clear in the demand, and the murderer shall surely be put to death. Turn your Bibles to Numbers chapter 35, Numbers 35, and let's look at verse 16, 17, and 18 as we come to a close at this section. Note what it says. But if he struck him down with an iron object, so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. If he struck him down with a stone in the hand by which he will die, as a result he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he struck him with a wooden object in the hand by which he might die, and as a result he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Now look at Numbers 35. Again, I want you to see this. He shall be put to death. We are given a divine command that man is responsible for man, and particularly when man violates the sixth commandment, lo tazar, or thou shalt not murder, you shall not take the life of another human being who's been made in the image of God, because when you take the life of another person, if one sheds blood, it is accounted to him as though he had diminished the divine image.